Welcome alle sammen, back to another video where we're comparing the Greek and the Old Norse religion. As you guys have seen in the other videos I've done in the past few months, the two religions and cultures were really not all that different. They are in the same Indo-European family, and they definitely had more practices and beliefs in common than they had different. So today we're examining the famous sacrifices, arguably the most important practice of the old European pagan religions out of all of them. And it's by far the practice that we have the most sources on from the European pagan religions. Unfortunately, we don't have enough sources to know exactly how it was done, but what we can do is use the Greek and the Norse sources to fill in the blanks of each other and determine the lost beliefs of our people. So I've already done a ton of videos on Norse sacrifices on my channel. You can check them all out here. So in this video we are covering the sources on the ancient Greek sacrifices, and I'll give my analysis on whether the same practice would have taken place in pagan rituals during the Viking Age. So here we go. First thing, altars. It's very, very important. Almost always a sacrifice will take place at an altar. In the Greek text, it's referred to either as Shera or Bomos. I'm probably not saying those right. But yeah, those are in the written sources that I'm going to go over here. But they're also in the archaeology. Like you can see here, there are still a lot of these in Greece today. They're basically large stone platforms, some of them hundreds of square meters big or wide. Now, the Old Norse pagan word for altar was hyrgir, so this was a pile of stones or a mound. So it's the same principle as in ancient Greece. It's a big... It's an elevated platform of varying sizes. They had smaller altars in Greece too, but always made out of stone. We do have a couple sources though mentioning altars as something else, such as this one where it was referred to as a pile of flowers in the middle of the temple. But note that this source is for some sort of ancestral celebration, not necessarily a sacrifice to the gods. So it seems as gods get offerings on a traditional stone altar, but altars had many different uses for many other things. And before we move on, there's some etymology connecting the Greek word for altar to a fireplace or a place to burn something, considering that Greek sacrifices were very often burned. This is something we don't find any trace of in the Norse sources, but I'll touch on that in just a bit. So first we'll start with the oldest, most reliable, and most detailed descriptions of Greek sacrifices, and they come from the Homeric poems, which is the Iliad and the Odyssey, which I'm sure you've all heard of. They're some of the oldest and most respected sources on the Greek religion, dating back to the 8th century BC. And the reason I like the poems by Homer especially is because these were a time closer to when the Greeks were practicing their true, original, untainted religion. A lot of these sources that we will find from a bit later on in time that come in the following 1,000 years after Homer, they seem to reflect a more tainted Greek religion influenced by foreign characteristics and even some monotheism, even though it could be before Christianity even. But I'll touch on all that and why in just a minute. But yeah, here are the longest and most detailed descriptions of Greek sacrifices from the Homeric poems. One good one comes in the Iliad. It is a sacrifice to Apollo, a grand hectacomb, so a public spectacle. Everyone is gathered around an altar. They wash the hands, sprinkled barley meal on the animals to be sacrificed, and there's even a real pagan prayer to Apollo here. They killed the animals and took the thigh meat and burned it in the fire. And this was going to the god Apollo. And then the rest of the meat was eaten by the people, and they had a grand feast and drinking and gave their offerings. So all of this agrees pretty much spot on with the other sources on Greek sacrifices that we have, and seems to be a perfect guideline. We have Norse sources too agreeing with a lot of this, but there are a couple differences that I will touch on later. Next one, in the Odyssey, there are actually 3 very detailed descriptions of sacrifices. The first one is right here. Firewood was chopped to be burned. A fine fat boar was to be sacrificed at the altar. They cut the bristles from the pig and they threw them in the fire as they prayed. And in this source, it goes into deep detail about the actual slaughter process of the boar. And maybe a little too much information there, a little gory, but hey, at least it gives us an instructional that is not found anywhere in the Norse sources. So if you do want to butcher an animal according to the ancient pagan tradition, this would be how it is done. Next, in the Odyssey, it mentions a sacrifice to Minerva. Same kind of thing. They sacrificed a cow, specifically a heifer, so a cow that had not given birth yet. Washed their hands in spring water, sprinkled barley meal again, cut some hair off the cow and threw it into the fire. Again, there they did some prayers, and then the animal was slaughtered, and the thigh meat was thrown into the fire again, and wine poured over it at that point. So again, it's pretty similar to the last one. Final one in the Odyssey. This is actually quite different than the ones I just went over. It comes in books 10 and 11. This one is not really a big public sacrifice to the gods, but more a private one done by King Odysseus with a sacrifice to the dead spirits of the underworld. And this is the one that goes really into the most detail. And guys, this is actually my favorite description of any pagan ritual in all the sources around the world. Any pagan ritual around the world, and any source that describes it, this is my #1 favorite. And this is actually a picture-perfect Alphablut, like in the Norse tradition that we have sources of, a sacrifice to the elves or the ancestral spirits. It's a sacrifice to the dead, invoking them for help, exactly like we find in so many Norse sources, but in this Greek source, it goes into a lot more detail about how everything is done and why those things are done. So it's basically making a sacrifice to summon the dead and ask for counsel, prophecy, and some other things. Odysseus goes to a place that is connected to the underworld, Hades, and it's a sacred island with a grove of fruit trees, and these rivers here are flowing through, which is still a real place in Greece today, by the way. And I've done videos on sacred places in the Norse beliefs. It's the exact same kind of thing here in ancient Greece. Islands, groves, rivers, springs, they're all known to be sacred places and sacrificial sites in the Viking Age, ancient Greece, and beyond, many places in the world. So the location is very important, guys, doing these things. There is very clearly only a few sacred places where these rituals would have the best effect. You're not going to be summoning the gods very well on an altar in your bedroom anywhere near as well as you would be doing so at a sacred place such as Sayre in Denmark, or Uppsala in Sweden, or Helgafell in Iceland, or any of these other sacred places that are mentioned in the Norse sources as really being a central site to do the sacrifices. Then after, in this source, Odysseus digs a hole or a trench to pour the sacrificial stuff in. Again, many sources, actually more sources in the folk tradition in Scandinavia, mention that this was done long after the Viking Age. The idea is that we dig into the ground where the dead, because that's where they are buried and that's where the offering should go to them. Next, Odysseus leaves the offering of honey, milk, wine, and barley meal. So those things we definitely have some records of in the Norse tradition being left as offerings, but it's more so in the folk tradition from after the Viking Age, even all the way up until the 1800s actually, we have records of those things being left out as offerings around the property, or on burial mounds, or on trees and things like that, or on stones called elvekjern. Also, butter is a preferred offering in the Norse tradition too. But most importantly, it's the blood offering. So that's when Odysseus pours in the trench from a sacrificial sheep, And this is what we see in the Norse sources from the Viking Age, was left as a sacrifice most often. But in this Greek source, we actually discover why they leave blood as a sacrifice. And it is not only to the spirits of the dead, and it's not just because the spirits of the dead like blood, but it actually gives these spirits some sense and consciousness. It's covered in the whole book 11 from the Odyssey, but I'm just summarizing it here. Dead spirits basically wander the underworld in a confused, unconscious state, kind of like we are when we are in a dream. When they drink the blood, it brings some life force back to them for a bit. It jogs their memory. They remember who they are. They remember who you are. It increases their conscious. And then these spirits of the dead are able to give advice, guidance, prophecy, and other great benefits and wisdom that Odysseus receives from the dozens of dead family members, heroes, and deities that he encounters in this sacrifice. You can also use blood to give a little life force to any kind of spiritual being, whether it be a statue of a god, an altar, a tree, or an object that you have carved runes on maybe, and we have sources for all that in the Norse world, reddening it with blood. No matter what the item is, reddening something with blood gives it some of that life force to elevate it and make whatever spiritual entity that may be in it, more connected to us in the physical world. Same kind of beliefs about blood and life force in basically every pagan culture in the world. And this source is also why I don't recommend people ever give their own blood during any sacrifice or rituals, because Odysseus ended up summoning all kinds of spirits. Thousands of them came up from the underworld, and he feared that the most foul ones and beasts would come up, such as the Gorgon. And that's not exactly things that you want to come out from the underworld and have a taste for your own blood. So always use a sacrificial animal ethically if you choose to do something like this in the tradition. It's too much to go into here, but I recommend everyone read book 11 and 12 of the Odyssey. That is maybe my favorite source of all time of anything pagan. So now we can get on to the later sources. They are a lot shorter in nature, and they're like less reliable than the original to the original Greek religion and beliefs. But a lot of these shorter, more recent sources are short and to the point, and they give us a clear understanding of why some of these things was done. One of it is in Aristophanes' Peace. Same kind of stuff here as all the other sacrifices I've went over, just with one important addition I'll cover right here. Before the sacrifice, they walked around the altar counterclockwise. The Norse sources from the Viking Age and the later on folk tradition are filled with this practice, walking counterclockwise in circles, specifically walking 3 times around something to basically invoke or awaken whatever it is, whether it's the altar or the burial mound or a grave or a tree, whatever. Pretty simple. The idea is that if you want to continue the cycles of nature and fate and what is to happen, then you should use clockwise circles, because that is the direction the sun goes from our point of view in the northern hemisphere. If you want to disrupt and change something of these natural cycles, then you open that ritual with a counterclockwise movement. This is an ancient belief going all the way back to Vedic texts even. Next, we can speak about libations. Here's a text also from Aristophanes' Peace. This is just one of the many Greek sources underlining the importance of libations. A drink poured out as an offering to a god or deity. A lot of Norse pagans do this today, but we don't have any Norse sources or even any evidence at all that they did this in the Viking Age or before. We definitely have mentions of toasts drank to the gods. We even have in Håkon the Good saga at the Yule sacrifice, passing the drinking vessel over the fire while toasting to the gods. We even have some later on folk practices of pouring wine or mead or blood on evergreen trees, but this again, it's to symbolize pouring blood on something was very illegal, by the way. After Christianity came in, that was not allowed, so they replaced that with mead or wine and things like that, red fruits. But again, that's to symbolize the life force being placed on this. But we have no evidence that the Norse actually poured out any drinks to the gods or the dead or any of that. Same thing with burnt offerings. A lot of pagans do this today in their blots. This was done in the Mediterranean pagan cultures, and even more so in the Semitic cultures. We have more records of that being happened, but no records or any evidence that this was done in the Norse world, unless it was for a cremation funeral, of course, but that is not a blot or a sacrifice. So it's up to you guys. I used to talk shit about it for a lot of years. I don't do it myself, but I don't have any problem with people doing it if you want. You can do libations and burnt offerings if you like. Just know that it is more of a Mediterranean thing, and it seems from the Norse sources that this is actually the opposite of what they did, and it defeats the whole purpose of the sacrifice. The purpose of leaving a sacrifice in the Norse world is so that nature could come and take it, whatever that may be. Usually it's in the form of birds coming to take it. Many sources for that. That's why I just leave my offerings out there in the open to be taken. But if you guys want to believe that if you burn it, it automatically will show up on the god's doorsteps, that's fine, you can believe that. But maybe, look into some Greek or Roman paganism. That might be a better fit for you, as opposed to the Norse. But that's, just what you believe and what you want to do. Next, we have to speak about the purity of the sacrificial victim and the purity of the people giving the offering. So first of all, you gotta be clean, guys. Wash yourself before performing a blot or entering a temple or doing any spiritual ritual. Don't be a dirty bitch. There's tons of Greek sources for this. The Norse too, and any other culture around the world requires cleanliness for these things. It even gets pretty specific here, as you can see. If you banged a woman last night, then you could make a sacrifice the next day. But if you had a little pre-ritual fornication the same day, you had to wash yourself before performing a sacrifice. The best case, of course, is if you can wash yourself in a sacred spring, as this purifies more than anything. But look at this source. You could also wash and purify yourself with the blood from a pig or other sacrificial animal. We see this in the Norse sources as well, even though they don't refer to it as purification. But they would take a twig and sprinkle. They'd sprinkle the sacrificial animal's blood all over the temple, all over the altar, all over the people there, with blood. And we still do this today, by the way, and now you know the reason for it. It's for spiritual purification. It's not just some Wicca teenage girl who's trying to look scary for some Instagram photos. Also, there are a couple sources where the purity of the animal to be sacrificed is mentioned. It should be pure in body and spirit. One way you could tell if a bull should be sacrificed is if it made a deep bow. Another way to determine if an animal was pure is to observe the trembling and movements of the animal right before it was about to be sacrificed. This was probably what the act of, cutting a little bit of hair off the animal and throwing it into the fire was used for, as we saw in a couple of the other sources I spoke about earlier. The exact explanation of all this is not mentioned. Nothing similar is mentioned in any of the Norse sources either. But if any of you have some other ideas or explanations, you can let us all know down below. Let's speak about the most common thing that we find in the Greek sources that we don't find anywhere in the Norse sources at all, and that's the thigh meat that is given to the gods. Very clear that the thigh meat from the sacrifice should be reserved for the gods, and it was burned in most of the sources, as I've covered already. In some case, the king or the temple would get a portion of the thigh meat, and the rest of the meat goes to the people, and they would have a feast on that, but the thigh meat specifically goes to the gods or is set aside for the king or temple or whatever. I don't exactly know why this was done. The obvious explanation might be that thigh meat is the best tasting on an animal. It's, in my opinion at least. I think every animal's thigh meat tastes the best. Another possible explanation is that the femur is the biggest and strongest bone in most animals and most humans too. So yeah, there could be some delicacy thought about that. I don't know there. Was this the belief in the Norse world? No, we don't have any sources distinguishing between the parts of the animal in Viking Age sacrifices. I'm sure they did. We might even find something in the archaeology if we looked into it. All pagan cultures distinguished between certain body parts, which parts are associated with what. But there's no signs from the Norse sources, at least, that they planned this out, which body parts of the animal, which meat would go to the gods and whatnot. On the other side of things, we have a couple Greek sources that mention sometimes people they ate all the meat and they left the inedible parts to the gods, and this seems like it is more in line with what the Norse would have done in the more barren north with far less food to spare. So just a point there. Finally, to finish off the video, let's talk about prayers. So prayers in a sacrifice were definitely done in the Greek world. They were definitely done in the Norse world too, but the sources show that they were very different things, these very different types of prayers. I hate to say this, guys, and if there's any Greeks out there that have a lot of education in this, please let me know. I'd like to learn and speak to you more, but from the sound of things and from what the sources say on prayer in the Greek world, it seems like, at least by the time these sources were written, it seems like the Greeks had turned into cringe pagans, or at least the true understanding of their original religion was not common knowledge of just the regular average Greek of the time. It was only the spiritual leaders who had this knowledge, because the sources, on the sources on prayer, it's a lot of me, I need help, pray to the gods, praising the gods. Oh gods, you are so mighty. I need to ask you a favor, requesting things from the gods. It's very monotheistic type in the prayers we have in the Greek sources by the time they're written down. And this is the number one thing that bugs me about modern Norse pagans, or any pagans really. They're like, oh Zeus, I'm depressed, please help me. Oh Odin, I love you. Odin, I love you. Can you please help me with my job interview tomorrow? Oh, you guys have no idea the crap I've seen online on this. The Facebook groups, the Reddit groups. Oh, I work with Loki. He's my patron god. He helped me through some real struggles in my life, man. This type of prayer is absolutely not a part of Norse paganism. I argue it's not a part of any paganism, any pagan religions, if we go far back enough in time. When we go back to the original roots of all the pagan religions, I argue that this is actually what I'm writing my book on, by the way. It's almost done. I've spent 4 years of research on this, all the sources and archaeology on Norse pagan prayers. And what I've found is that there is no prayer in the traditional sense that you may think, like praising the god, saying how great the god is, and then asking him for a favor. In the Norse sources, we maybe have 2 to maybe 4 or 5 examples of, praising the gods and asking for something like straight out like that. We have dozens and dozens of records, though, of what I call indirect invocations, okay? They sung songs with a metaphor for the god in the song, to summon the god or whatever. Maybe they carved runes with a god's name in, hoping that it would take notice and come to the area. They chanted a god's name so that the god would come to the vicinity and perform and they would perform sacrifices and rituals almost in like a mock way in order to summon some of the energy that the god or goddess presides over and has the function of, so that the people could get the benefits. This is something all pagan cultures did if we go back far enough in time, especially if we get back to the oldest ones at their animistic roots. They were not praying to the gods. No, none of these oldest pagan cultures or animist cultures were praying to the gods and saying, oh, please help me, I'm sad. They're not like directing words to the god and asking for a favor. The original pagan cultures, at the oldest ones, they did things like trick the gods. They manipulated the gods. They even did the rituals and things to frighten the gods, to kind of manipulate the god to do whatever effect it was that they were trying to achieve. The Norse were still doing this in the Viking Age, but it seems like 1,000 years before this in ancient Greece, they had lost that true understanding by the time, and they had developed into the more monotheistic, oh God, I call upon you, I need a favor mindset, that kind of thing. Now, I might not be 100% right on that. The religious leaders and priests at the time in ancient Greece, I'm sure they know what they were doing. I'm sure they knew exactly what they were doing, and they were doing things in the correct and the oldest traditional manner. It's just the regular average Greek person at the time, and even the authors, lost the understanding of exactly what they were doing and how the priests were praying and why. It's very clear that the priests were the ones educated in these things, and that the job of sacrifice and prayer was reserved for them at the time. But like I said, in the oldest sources like Homer's Odyssey, just a regular king named Odysseus could do this all by himself. And I actually really like the prayers recorded in the Odyssey, which is probably a lot closer to what the oldest prayers would have been like from the oldest Greek origins of that religion. But that's just what I think. Let me know what you guys have to say, or if I missed any sources about prayer or sacrifices. But yeah, let us know down below in the comments. But that's all for today. Vi ses nästa gång.